Oddball show features content intended for mature audiences. If you'd like to view a content warning before listening, please check out the episode description. The views put forth by our hosts and our guest reflect the speaker's opinions and not the official stance of Oddball Foundation. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoy the show.
So there's been this huge increase in the number of people diagnosed with serious mental illness caused by these drugs.
Now,
starting out with children. And the worst, let me just say this, the worst are foster children. Okay, now they've gotten put in foster care because there's been a finding, it's been determined by a court that they've been subjected to abuse or neglect, okay, to the point where they need to be yanked out of their home. You know, if they're in that kind of a situation, they're likely to act out, right? Okay, then, but no matter how bad their home situation, if they get yanked out of it, they'll be upset about that. And I mean, some are happy to, but mostly not. That's going to cause them to act out. And these foster homes often are very terrible. And so that's going to cause them to act out. And so rather than help them deal with all this stuff that's happened to them, they're told there's something wrong with your brain. We need to drug you basically into submission for the rest of your life. You're not responsible for your behavior, that's because of your mental illness. And this is all exactly the wrong message to be given to children and youth.
Hey everybody, it's Jason Wright from Oddball Show. Today I'd like to welcome Jim Gottstein. Jim is the president and CEO of Psych, a nonprofit public interest law firm whose mission is to mount a strategic litigation campaign against forced psychiatric drugging and electric shock in the U.S. He holds a law degree from Harvard Law School and has been an attorney advocate for people diagnosed with serious mental illness for over 20 years. He's a powerhouse advocate for medicinal victims, and I'm so pumped to talk to him about his story and how it feels to tackle big pharma and exactly how cold it is in the winter in Alaska. In all seriousness, I am honored to speak with Jim. I'm really excited to get his perspective on a number of important issues. Jim Gottstein, welcome to Oddball Show.
Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to be here.
I'm so pumped to talk to you today. First off, how's Alaska?
Oh, Alaska is great, but I'm on Maui right now. But it's been quite the winter there.
Oh, yeah.
So they've had a ton of snow. They had roofs that collapsed, and I'm happy to be on Maui.
I should have noticed that that you don't look like you are wind chilled. You look very tan. So, I mean, maybe if you were in Alaska, you'd get that wind burn. It looks like you just have a very healthy tan. So I should have known. Why from Alaska to Maui? What's going on?
Well, I used to love the winters there, and I did a lot in the snow. I cross-country skied. I had a ski plane. I put it on floats in the summer, but a ski plane, and I did that. And but getting older, I quit doing all that stuff, and I pretty much always, tried to get to Maui for some part of the winter. And as much as I liked winter, unlike the summer, you could take a few weeks out and there's plenty left. I mean, that's the main thing about Alaska winters is they're long. I mean, there are other places in the U.S. where they're probably, where they're just as cold or colder than Anchorage anyway, but not as long. Anyway, so I had enough winter.
I'll tell you, I went to Maui once and it was life-changing. I did the road to Hana. I'm sure you're like, road to Hana, that's some tourist stuff, but I've done it and it was amazing. Have you ever done it?
Oh yeah, it's quite the trip. I think it's something that people should do when they come here. I don't know that you need to do it more than once.
Yeah.
But oh yeah, Maui's an amazing place. It really is.
It really is. It's so let me ask you, how is the culture in Hawaii, in Maui specifically? What is the stance on mental health in Hawaii? would you say? Your perspective.
So frankly, I'm not that tuned into it. So, and I don't even think they have an inpatient facility on Maui. But there's a pretty big homeless problem here, and housing has just gotten really unaffordable. And there are people who've lived here for decades, people whose family, has been there for generations, who are leaving because they can't afford it here. And so you've got all these tourists, coming, and then you've got all these people, buying up the housing and increasing the prices to the point where people can't afford it. So now that I'm here, I think we should close the door and not let anybody else in.
I'm coming. Jim, can I ask you a question? What is the difference between Hawaii and Alaska when it comes to sort of the mental health culture, if there is one?
Well, I would say that Alaska is pretty standard, which is basically terrible. And again, I don't think there's any inpatient on Maui, but Hawaii, I don't know that it'd be that much different. It tends to be a little bit easier to be homeless here.
Yeah.
So I think that's a factor. But there are a lot of homeless people in Alaska and in Anchorage in particular, and Juneau too. I don't know so much about Fairbanks, which gets really cold in the winter. So, and people tend to congregate, get kind of moved into Anchorage as they have problems around the state. They, get shipped to the hospital in Anchorage. Anyway, it's definitely a different world.
So Jim, I got a question for you. I interviewed Al Galves on the podcast. You can check it out on Oddball show, and he's from Mind Freedom International. He talked about Soteria houses. I know you have a big connection with Mind Freedom International. In fact, you're a board member of Mind Freedom International, and Soteria houses are a big part of Mind Freedom International. Just planting an idea in your head. What about one in the beautifulest part of Alaska and the beautifulest part of Maui, Hawaii?
Well, I got one going in Alaska, Soteria, Alaska, and it was kind of a magical place. We did have a tragedy there, a murder, but that isn't what closed it. Basically, the funding was just so tight that it closed down. So it was really, like I said, a magical place. It kind of depended on who was there at the time and what was going on. So Soteria houses, yeah, they they can help people not get tracked into a career as a mental patient.
Let's stop here for a moment for a note for our listeners. Soteria, Alaska opened in Anchorage, Alaska in 2009. It was modeled off of the original Soteria house, which was run by Lauren Mosier in San Jose, California in the 1970s. Like that original project, Soteria, Alaska existed to provide housing and compassionate care for people experiencing psychosis, and was especially intended to help folks in their first psychotic episode get through the experience without going on medication, and becoming, as Gottstein has argued, quote, chronic disabled mental patients. Jim Gottstein, our interviewee, helped found both the nonprofit Soteria, Alaska, as well as its partner organization, Choices, Inc. You can find his account of Soteria, Alaska in the show notes. So the event he's referring to is that in 2011, a 21-year-old former resident of Soteria, Alaska, Mike McAvoy, returned to the house and shot to death 19-year-old Moselle Nayland, a former resident and current volunteer. According to McAvoy's attorney, McAvoy, who'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia, was in the midst of a psychotic episode and believed that he was shooting a dragon. Nevertheless, McAvoy's legal team did not try to plead insanity. Alaska's standards for that legal argument are quite stringent, and McAvoy also apparently did not want to pursue that argument and, quote, hide behind his mental illness. Soteria, Alaska managed to remain open for a few more years, but it shut down in 2015 due to funding issues. Choices, Inc., from which Gottstein had resigned years before to avoid potential conflicts of interest with his legal work, had, according to Gottstein, begun to drift away from its original mission to provide non-coercive care. Nevertheless, he maintains that during its years of operation, Soteria, Alaska had a, quote, profoundly positive effect on many of its residents. You can read Gottstein's thoughts on this in an article that we have provided in the show notes.
So we were talking about Soteria houses and Mind Freedom International. I know you're a big part of Mind Freedom International. Would Soteria houses be similar to what we have in New England and especially in Massachusetts, peer respites, which to my listeners, peer respites, as I know them, are people who lived experience, let people who have lived experience live while they're getting their meds sorted away instead of being hospitalized. It's kind of like an alternative to treatment. Your thoughts?
There's a really similar philosophy between peer respites and Soteria houses. The original Soteria house was a study in the 1970s, and the idea was have people that go into a home-like setting where the expectation was that people would get better. The first time that they got, had psychosis, which means going crazy, and to really try not to put them on psych drugs, and especially the neuroleptics, which they call antipsychotics, even though they don't have antipsychotic properties for most people. And the fundamental philosophy was to be with people rather than do to them. And there was no, real restriction on how long people could stay. So it tended to be about 3 months, and to get people to work through that. And they could go, they could go to work or school. And I mean, certainly not locked. Neither of them were locked. They're all voluntary. And it was originally designed, again, for first time, mental breakdowns, or I don't like the word psychosis, but that's how it was categorized. And peer respites really tend to be, and the Soteria houses are not necessarily staffed by peers, people with lived experience of being in the mental health system, but they have to be really empathetic and not mind being with crazy people. And peer respites are staffed, and they should be completely operated by peers, people that have been through it. And the people who go there tend to be people who have been in the system before and run into trouble and just need a break. And they tend to have a week or 10-day limit to how long people can stay there. Mind Freedom and this organization called Rethinking Psychiatry had this International Peer Respite and Soteria Summit, the 5 Octobers of Sundays in October of 2021, which 750 people from 40 countries came to. So peer respites, I think, they're newer, less than 20 years old, I think. But they're easier to get going, and there are a lot more of them. And but they're people trying to get Soteria houses and peer respites going, more of them.
Can I ask a question? Soteria. What is the definition of Soteria?
Soteria means deliverance.
I had no idea that's what it meant. That's beautiful. So how does deliverance have to do with recovery?
Well, there is this story that's told by mainstream psychiatry that mental illness is the result of some kind of brain defect. They changed the story. They've never proven it. And that there's, it's permanent and you're never going to get better. And so what Soteria does is deliver you from that. And the idea is to get through what you're going through and on to, the life that you're hopefully meant to lead.
Wow, what a beautiful perspective on humanity. And I feel, and I'll just say, in my opinion, I feel there needs to be a little bit more humanity in mental health. And I feel like peer respites and Soteria houses and having peer support in mental health agencies and stuff like that is at least in the right direction of humanity. I think some of the next things are, more Soteria houses, more communities that are less restrictive, and then maybe somehow talking to people about why do they feel like they need to put a medication into someone's hand for the rest of their life to heal their trauma. And that's my opinion.
The mental health system is nuts, frankly. There's this myth that people don't get better. And that there's this idea that what gets diagnosed as mental illness is just a misfiring of neurons, and therefore what's going on with the person doesn't have any meaning, and that's just not the case. And so the approach in both Soterias and pure respites is that whatever someone's going through has meaning, and just let them go through that. And so, for example, one of the things, because of that outlook by the traditional mental health system, is that they wouldn't think of asking the person, what do you want? What would you find helpful? And that's the fundamental thing that we should be doing with people, is asking what would be helpful. And people need to feel safe. It's one of the fundamental things for helping people, is for them to feel safe. The traditional mental health system is just the opposite. I mean, they lock people up. They oftentimes get, taken into custody by police and put in handcuffs and, put behind closed doors. And then being in the hospital, I kind of liken it to Alice in Wonderland. It's just, and it's the staff. They lie to people. I mean, they'll say, oh, we're going to let you out in 2 days, and then they don't. And then when someone gets angry, when the person gets angry about that, then that's put down as, a symptom of your mental illness. And in fact, everything that happens that you do when you're in a psych hospital gets written up as a symptom. So like I said, you can have a legitimate reason to be angry, and that's put down as a symptom. Oh, you're labile, right? Okay. So then if you decide, oh, I'm just not going to react to anything, well, then you have a flat affect, right? Mm-hmm. And then, so then if something strikes you as amusing, you laugh to yourself, then you're responding to internal stimuli. Psych hospitals are very counterproductive. One of the main reasons that people are locked up supposedly is to, because of harm to self, generally meaning suicide risk. Well, whether people were suicidal or not when they went in, the suicide rate of people who have just recently been discharged from a hospital is just skyrockets. It's like 100 times. They're just terrible places, and it's really important to find these non-coercive places like Soteria houses and pure respites. And there are other models too, the Hearing Voices Network, and there's this approach called open dialogue. And then Sweden, I think it was, they had what's called healing homes, where they put people on, with families on farms, and they just, they become part of the family and work on the farm. And all of these are very successful compared to the current system, where the recovery rate is basically 5%. And if you do these other approaches, you can get 80% recovery rate. So it's just kind of astounding that this regime, perpetuates.
So Jim, in your personal, professional opinion, or just your human opinion, do you feel like if we talk more about this and the ideas of different alternatives to treatment, that there will be more Soteria houses, that there will be petitions to sign for Soteria houses, or to, make more peer involved things or things like that? Currently, as part of Oddball Foundation, and I'm speaking as president of Oddball Foundation right now, putting on my president hat of Oddball Foundation. Oddball Foundation is a 501c3 for mental health advocacy, right? And part of our mission is through creative advocacy, through Oddball Magazine, that's freedom of speech, poetry, and literary expression. And then Oddball Show is getting people like you on the show, getting people like Al Galves and Will Hall. And I once got Slug from Atmosphere. Now, that was just a dream of mine. He was a hip hop artist that I adore, and I had him on the show. And for me, that was a little selfish because we didn't talk about mental health that much, but it was more like achieving a dream of like, whoa, this guy's an incredible artist. I have him on my show to talk about what, you know what I mean? But now it's more focused to talk about how can we make a difference using this platform, using Mad in America, using people who like might hear this and be like, wait a minute, this is a better idea than, you know, forced institutions and stuff. Or is this a dangerous thing to talk about this kind of stuff? Is this stuff is dangerous?
Oh, I think we have to talk about it, and we really have to try and educate the public. I think the big problem is that we tend to, you know, talk amongst ourselves, you know, preach to the choir, so to speak. And so the key is to make this information more general, you know, people more generally aware of it, the general public. And so, you know, I've done videos and, you know, stuff, and I've written stuff, and people find it. And that's actually a big part of the big reason why I wrote the Zyprexa papers, because I felt like it was something that could cross over into the general public, and that people, you know, could really learn some astounding things that they didn't know before. And I like to think that it's engaging and readable and all that. And one of the, for example, one of the things that I do in it is there were a number of psychiatric survivors that were involved in it. So you mentioned Will Hall. He was one. He was the person that arranged to get the Zyprexa papers untraceably out on the internet, and what's a precursor to WikiLeaks. So this was 2006. So I describe Will, you know, and he's one, you know, and he, like the other ones, he was diagnosed with a serious mental illness and locked up and told he would never get better. And, you know, now he's, you know, he's kind of world famous in those circles. He's working on his PhD. He's a marvelous therapist, and doing all this stuff. And there are other people too. Ron Bassman, who wrote this great book called A Fight to Be. And he was given insulin coma, you know.
How old is he? How old is
he's close
this
to 80 now. He's close to 80 now. He's in his late 70s, and maybe he is 80. And Ted Chabazinski, now he's 86, and he was one of the first children who was given, who was electroshocked as a child. His mother was locked in a psych hospital for, you know, most of her adult life, and he, you know, and so they decided he was mentally ill, and he, as a, you know, and he was told he would never, you know, amount to anything, and he put himself through college and law school and all that, and he was part of it. And David Oakes, who was the founder of Mind Freedom, he was a working class kid from Chicago at Harvard University, and he ran into trouble, and he was, you know, locked up and drugged against his will, and he graduated from Harvard and went on to found Mind Freedom and do amazing stuff. And Judy Chamberlain, I mean, all these people.
So I want to go back to insulin shock therapy. So I just read Mind Fixers by Ann Harrington. I don't know if you've read it. She's a Harvard professor. I'd love to have her on the show, but this book, Mind Fixers, and we're about to do a 12-minute podcast about, I've been doing these 12-minute podcasts, and I just did one on the Insane Liberation Front. Maybe we can talk about that in just 2 seconds, but if you know anything about it, because I think it's fascinating. But I wanted to talk about that insulin shock therapy, and these different like ideas of like treatments back then. So he was 80 years old and he had insulin shock therapy. Not at the time, he was a young kid probably, and he had insulin shock therapy. That is, I mean, I know that's
I wouldn't call it therapy though.
Insulin shock treatment, right? But didn't they call it
or
insulin
either.
shock?
I wouldn't call it treatment.
But didn't they call it insulin shock therapy? That was the name.
Well, they call it just like they call it ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. But I don't consider it therapy. I just call it electroshock.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
And so insulin coma, there are not that many people still alive that have done that because they quit doing that. I mean, there's a pretty high mortality rate with it. And the same with electroshock. I think Ron got electroshock too. So
Jim, I'm just going to inform the audience about what I think insulin coma therapy is, so people like know what we're talking about. So insulin coma therapy in the book that I read was they would give people high amounts of insulin to make them into a coma. Am I correct? They would go into a coma and then they would come out, and there was like a 25% success rate. So they're like, "Wow, win!" And didn't the guy get a Nobel Prize for that? I think he might have, but I'm not sure. So that was one of the treatments before meds, basically. So just to let people know who are listening about Oddball Show. So continue insulin shock therapy. That's I know what you're saying, Jim.
Insulin coma, yeah. So yeah, they put him in a coma, and then one of the things, there's this book called Mad in America by Robert Whitaker, written in 2002, which really prompted me to found the Law Project for Psychiatric Rights, Psych Rights. And one of the things he does is go through all these different so-called treatments that they did, and like they would do things like they would dunk people tie people up in a chair and dunk them underwater and almost drown them, and then they'd come out, and they would, so then supposedly they'd have a great success rate. And
wow, that's barbaric, man. That's barbaric.
They had like spinning chairs that they would do.
What was the point of that?
Yeah, and so and they would all claim success, great success rates until then. After a while, they figured out it wasn't that great. But my theory is that some people were just so scared by it that they decided they managed to quit doing what they were doing that was causing people to be concerned about them. So insulin coma, really fits in that. Electroshock fits in that.
Wow.
And it's just all this really barbaric interventions, I've taken to calling it, that are extremely physically harmful. And the current psychiatric drug regime is, I don't know, probably just as bad. Maybe,
So Jim, knowing this history of mental illness and the dunking of water, never knew that. The spinning chairs, don't even know what that is. And we don't have to talk about it. I want to talk about, how did you become a lawyer? Like, did you want to change this system from the beginning and that was your idea?
So no. So I come from a privileged family. My dad had a pretty big business in Alaska, and I went to college and was going to be a business major. And I took and one of the required classes was business law, and I didn't miss a question in that class. And I go, And I took advanced business law, and I missed a question, but I decided that it was a pretty good fit for me. And so I went to law school. I mean, I was the only skydiving pilot from Alaska that applied to Harvard Law School that year, which I think helped me get in. And so I had graduated from law school, and it was after that, I think probably 4 years after that, that I got in a situation where I didn't get sleep. I was trying to do too much, and I went crazy. I jumped out of my dad's second floor bedroom window in my underwear at 1 a.m.
Not to laugh.
But I knew how to do a parachute landing fall. The devil was coming down the hall, and so it was logical to jump out the window, right? And so I jumped out the window, and I did a perfectly good parachute landing fall. I didn't hurt myself. It was June, so 1 a.m. It was light. I ran across the street to this parking lot, and I kept looking over my shoulder for the devil, because the devil. So I was spinning around, and they captured me and put me in a straitjacket and hauled me to the hospital and pumped me full of something to put me down. And I woke up there. I was in the psych hospital, and I was lucky not to have been made permanently mentally ill by the system, because those that believed I was a lawyer said I would never practice law again. When I told them I'd gone to Harvard Law School, well, that confirmed I was delusional. And this is all true. And
I agree. I know what you're talking
about. But my mother, who was actually the head of the Alaska Mental Health Association, she connected me up with this really terrific psychiatrist who said, look, you just got yourself in a situation where you didn't sleep. Anybody who doesn't sleep for long enough will, go crazy. And you just have to learn how to deal with that. And I'm not particularly tolerant of lack of sleep. So I learned how to deal with that. And, but anyway, it changed my outlook on life. I mean, before that, I had no idea that my thinking could be, so screwed up. So that was just a complete shock. But since then, I've really learned how to deal, basically deal with things. So
this is incredible. What a story. My first mental health break that I had no idea that bipolar was even a thing. I walked 36 miles on the highway. It's not that hard to walk when you got a lot of energy. And it was a nice day out. And man, did I have a trip. And it was like, it wasn't like I took acid or anything. It was like, just like, in fact, I went to Salem Hospital. They gave me some really fucked up meds. I brought them home to a dorm room that I was at someone's like a little house. And the next day I was like, I can't sleep. I guess I'm going to start walking. And there I was on the highway. And eventually I was like, I guess I'm going to keep on walking. Where the hell am I going to go now? And then I just went on a journey, man. And that journey ended up getting me to a mall right next to like Leahy Clinic, which is a place in Massachusetts. And by the way, this was 2000 and George Bush was president. George Bush Jr. was president. And before I thought there was no worse guy than this guy. I thought he was the worst person ever. And I was scared and angry and pissed off. And I was like acting like I was Captain America, man, on this walk. And I was like talking to myself about everything. And so this patrolman pulls me over. I'm walking. He comes to me and he says, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm doing nothing, sir. I'm just walking down the highway, sir." Because I'm like not trying to get arrested, And I was like, I'm a good boy, just walking. And he got me off the highway. And then I ended up walking some more. And I like walked through woods and shit. And I'm walking to this mall. And I couldn't walk anymore. I had walked from Salem to Burlington, Massachusetts. So if you know that, that's a long walk. And I ended up hobbling myself. And I said at this mall, I said, "Where the fuck is the hospital?" Over and over and over again. "Where the fuck is the hospital?" And I ended up hobbling into Leahy Clinic. And there, fucking George Bush is on the TV screen. I go, "Turn this shit off." And I walk in. And I'm like, "Excuse me, I'd like to get my feet clean so I can go to New York City. Can you clean my feet?" And then they kept me. and I woke up at McLean Hospital. Now, I had no idea that McLean Hospital was, by standards, the best hospital I've ever been to. Now, my directive is like, I'd like to go to McLean Hospital, and everything is like, sorry, there's no beds available. You're going to go to this really shitty hospital. You're going to go to this other really shitty hospital. You're going to go to this other really shitty hospital. So I don't know, maybe I have to walk another 62 miles to get to McLean Hospital. I feel like there's like a thing, but maybe I was in the right place in the right time. But what I'm getting at, because, everyone knows McLean Hospital, like in Psych is like probably one of the most world-renowned. I mean, James Taylor went there, Emily Dickinson went there. Anyway, but what I'm getting at is I can relate to jumping out of a window. I just walked 36 miles, which was like jumping out of a window, metaphorically. But I want to talk about how you went from a lawyer to taking on big pharma. Let's talk about it. Like, that is an amazing thing. But before that, I want to talk about the idea of how you kind of came up with this idea of the fact that kids are being drugged. And I was one of the kids who was drugged in 1990. Didn't know that it would be a thing. I had no idea, man. I had read a book, and actually, no, my dad had read a book and told me, hey, you should read this book. I'm like, I can't read this book. He's like, let's go to the psychiatrist. And that's what happened to me. So, and then after that, 5 years later, shocker, I'm bipolar. So, Jim, why, and is this getting better? Why are they drugging, and I'm going to say drugging, why are they drugging kids at a younger age these days, in your opinion?
Well, it's ridiculous. I mean, if you look at the definition of ADHD, what is it? Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And it's like, do they fidget excessively? Do they not pay attention to boring teachers? Well, they don't say boring teachers, and, all these things. It's like, well, yeah, this is like, an 8-year-old boy. And so, they expect children to sit behind these desks and listen to boring teachers. And they're even, I think, cut out recess a lot of the time. And the range of acceptable behavior has just gotten so narrow. And so they decide, that there's something wrong with them when they're just being regular kids. And the worst. So I ran into someone I went to grade school with at the airport one time. And, and she told me she was a school counselor. And I said, oh, this drugging of children is terrible. And she said, yeah, but there's so many kids in the classroom. It's the only way that the teachers can keep control of the class, because that's what these stimulants do, is they basically suppress. I mean, they're a stimulant, but they end up making people the children so that they focus on what the adults want them to focus on. So they're easier to manage. And then I said, but they're really terrible. And she says, well, but the teachers can't manage the classes without them. So that's what's going on. And one of the things that happens is that a pretty high percentage of children and youth that get put on the stimulants then have a manic reaction to it. It sounds like you. So then they say, oh, you have bipolar disorder. Oh, that sounds like you. What happened to you? Okay. And so then they put them on, these stronger drugs, which are also, actually make things worse. So it used to be that, Dr. Peter Breggin, who's like maybe one of the most famous psychiatrists who really is critical of what's going on. He said that, for a long time in his career, he never even met anybody that was diagnosable with bipolar, was called manic depressive at the time, bipolar disorder. Well, now they put people on these drugs, and especially the so-called antidepressants. And it used to be that someone would have a manic episode every might have one and not have another one, might have two and not have another one, might have three and not have another one, or might have one, every so often, like every few years. And now with these drugs, people are just cycling back and forth between being manic and depressed, back and forth, like it can happen, within a matter of days, or, and it's gotten really common. And it's a result basically of the so-called antidepressant drugs, which, have been shown to be no better than placebo, except maybe for people that are really seriously depressed, and cause manic, these manic episodes. And then people get diagnosed with even schizophrenia. So there's been this huge increase in the number of people diagnosed with serious mental illness caused by these drugs.
Now,
starting
Jim,
out with children. And the
I'm
worst,
sorry,
let me just say this, the worst are foster children. Okay, now they've gotten put in foster care because there's been a finding, it's been determined by a court that they've been subjected to abuse or neglect, okay, to the point where they need to be yanked out of their home. Well, if a child or youth is subject to it, maybe they have, maybe they haven't, but probably they have. But if if they're in that kind of a situation, they're likely to act out, right? Okay, then, but no matter how bad their home situation, if they get yanked out of it, that's probably gonna, they'll be upset about that. And I mean, some are happy too, but mostly not. That's gonna cause them to act out. And these foster homes often are very terrible. And so that's going to cause them to act out. And so rather than help them deal with all this stuff that's happened to them, and manage their emotions, they're told there's something wrong with your brain. We need to drug you basically into submission for the rest of your life. You're not responsible for your behavior, that's because of your mental illness. And this is all exactly the wrong message to be given to children and youth.
So, Jim, in your opinion, why are we medicating trauma?
Well, it's because the psychiatrists have no purpose if they don't get to drug people. It used to be, and they're MDities, and so they get to say. So it used to be that psychiatrists basically did talk therapy, and then they got a lot of competition from medical doctors, from psychologists and, even social workers who started doing therapy. And so then they teamed up with the pharmaceutical industry and said, oh, well, we're MDs. What do MDs do? They prescribe medication. And so they basically used their authority and said, mental illness is something, wrong with the brain. I mean, it's interesting, they would tell people that it's a chemical imbalance, and now the head of the former head of the American Psychiatric Association says, oh, we never said that there was a chemical imbalance, and no one ever really believed that. But people are still being told that. And they say, oh, well, it's genetic. Well, that's never been proven. There's this, I mentioned it before, this Hearing Voices Network, and their approach is to not ask what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And so, so you ask, why are they, treating trauma with drugs? They are saying it's not a result of trauma. It's a result of some inherent defect in your brain, and that's never been proven.
As a peer support specialist, my role before peer support specialist was person with mental illness in middling company in a very crappy role where I was menial and I wore headphones and no one talked to me. That was my role. As a certified peer specialist, I'm able to use my lived experience. Great. I love it. I am passionate about it. Now, do you recommend people who are in peer peer work, certified peer specialists, people who are lived experience, people who are in the mental health system, do you recommend that they go as far as they can within the realm of the mental health system? Should they go for a higher degree? Should they cross into counseling? Should they cross into psychiatry? Or should they do something else? Should they be someone who is sort of a contrarian who wants to shut down the system, or someone who gets in the system to improve it?
Well, I think that with respect to the latter, that we really need both. I mean, one of the things with the psychiatric survivor, and then consumers kind of have, mental health consumers kind of have a different outlook, is that, some people say, oh, if you work for the system, then you're a traitor. Well, I don't believe that. I think that you've got to have people inside, but there's a limit to how much you can challenge the system from the inside. So there really need to be people on the outside who are really challenging it. In terms of professional, growth or advancement, yeah, I think people should, do what they want, what their objectives might be. I mean, my sense of things is there tends not to be a lot of opportunity for advancement in the peer specialist world, especially those that are working in programs that are not consumer operated, or peer, where the organization itself is directed by peers. But yeah, I think why shouldn't a peer be a CEO of a mental health center? I mean,
Right.
actually, Ron Bassman was, but it was before he outed himself as a peer.
Okay. So how does someone go from certified peer specialist to a higher role? Now, does that just involve education, going to get your master's degree, to have those letters be in front of your name, or is it something different? Is there a skeleton key of going from peer work to, where it's one-on-one stuff, affecting change on a personal level with one person, to inserting yourself into the system in a more, I don't know, in a way more than peer specialists sometimes feel. Sometimes they feel like there's like this ladder that I have to climb and there's nowhere I can go other than I'm knocking on places, nowhere else to go. Where do people go for me, first of all, getting to become a peer support specialist was the beginning of my recovery. So now that I'm in a place where I've learned so much, I have grown so much as a person, I could go probably anywhere, right? You could probably infect some other corporation or something, companies, whatever. But what if you want to be a change agent and they say, look, you're a certified peer specialist. And sometimes there's this idea of, look, there's really nothing here for you. So what would you give the advice to someone who has lived experience, who has just applied for, I know a lot of people have just applied for a certified peer specialist role and they are in it and they want to go farther? What is your advice, Jim Gottstein?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, do I really have great advice? I think in the traditional system, there's a lot of prejudice against peer specialists. And so I think that's difficult. But I think there, should be rooms for advancement. And I would say, if you can get inside a consumer operated program, like the Wildflower Alliance in Massachusetts, they've got peers all the way up to, up the organization. So I'm a big believer in having peer run organizations, not just peer support. And to the extent that peers are being used for medication compliance, no, that's not peer support. And and just trying to, and really being part of the traditional system. I mean, I don't know what you're doing, but I think that's, not really the basis of true peer support, which is, egalitarian. There's no hierarchy, and the idea is that both people contribute to the situation, and that, everybody's experience needs to be validated.
Which is beautiful. So to the Oddball Show listeners, me and Jim are talking about an idea called Certified Peer Specialists. It's a mental health agency model where people who have lived experience are also with the people who are in the system, and we are kind of part of it. We're there to support them and use our lived experience. So that is what we're talking about. So Oddball Show listeners who aren't familiar with this, that's what we're talking about. Now, if you're listening about and you're seeing Zyprexa papers and you're wondering what that is on Jim's screen, that is a book that Jim Gottstein wrote that is available. There's a QR code at the bottom of the screen, and it's available. So let's talk about the Zyprexa papers. I feel like it runs like a John Grisham novel. So, but it's real. So we'll talk about it a little bit.
So, I had a case, the Myers case, that set a pretty good precedent in Alaska, and they wanted to force Zyprexa on Faith Myers, and I had an expert that wrote this report called olanzapine, which is a generic or chemical name, dangerous drug, dubious efficacy, and she went through the documents that were submitted to FDA for its approval, and showed that basically that it was not very effective and harmful. And like I did with everything else, I posted it on the internet. And so out of the blue, I got this call from this expert witness who said, I'm privy to these secret documents that show that Eli Lilly knew from the beginning that these drugs caused that Zyprexa caused diabetes and other metabolic problems, and that they were illegally marketing it to children and youth. But I can't, give them to anybody unless I'm subpoenaed in another case. Will you subpoena me? And so I said, sure. So then, off we were to the races, and there's a whole, adventure on even finding a case. Because lawyer, you get to issue subpoenas, but you have to have a case and a proper reason. And so I found a case that was a whole thing in itself. And under the secrecy order, he had to give Lilly notice of the subpoena and an opportunity to object before he gave me the documents. And I figured, they'd be right on it, and I'd be arguing to the court why my client was entitled to get them. But no, they were a little slow, and he gave them to me. And he'd already been working with a reporter from the New York Times. Even though Eli Lilly was slow, I knew they'd be big and fast once they got going. So as soon as I got them out, and I not only to the New York Times, but other people. I mentioned Will Hall to get them out on the internet, and it hit the New York Times, the front page of the New York Times, and basically all hell broke loose. Eli Lilly threatened me with criminal contempt and to try and get me disbarred, and I basically got hauled to Brooklyn for in front of this judge and all that. And the judge decided that I had, quote, conspired to steal the documents. And so it's really quite a story. And that's about half the book. And the other half is about my representation of Bill Bigley, the person for whom I subpoenaed the Zyprexa papers. And his life was just destroyed by psychiatry. So I did what I could to minimize them being locked up and drugged. And that's quite a story in itself too. So that's about half of the book.
Wow. Okay. So everyone, the QR code is at the bottom. Please check out the Zyprexa papers. I want to ask you a question, Jim. You got the New York Times involved with this, which is great. Why does stuff like Zyprexa papers, stuff like the harm reduction guide to coming off of psych meds, other books, why do they not see the wider appeal from mainstream, or maybe they do, but on like a subculture scale? Why has mental health advocacy, like true mental health advocacy, in your opinion, why has it not gone mainstream, and why do not more people know about what is really going on within the mental health system?
So I think of it as fear and absolution. I mean, besides all the money that the drug companies make, exploiting this. But basically, people are afraid that they're going to get murdered in their beds by some crazy person. And so they need to be locked up and drugged. When the reality is, before the introduction of the drugs, people diagnosed with serious mental illness were no more likely to be violent than the general public. But it's scary, I mean, being, irrational people that seem irrational are scary to people. So that's part of it. The other is this idea that there's something inherently wrong with the person in their brain really absolves people from any role in the problem, that it was anything they did. I mean, there's this marvelous book called How to Become a Schizophrenic by John Modrow, and he writes about, how it happened to him. And this other one, this book, Escape from Psychiatry by Clover Smith, and all these are listed on the psychrights.org website, where she just fundamentally misunderstood something about her mother and her treatment, and that caused her problems. And she ended up recovering because a fly on the wall was communicating with her, and that ended up bringing her out of it. I met her. She was, I'm sure she's no longer with us, but she's just a marvelous person. And I think of responsibility as different than blame. So people can be responsible for causing problems in other people without being, blameworthy. It just just happens. I mean, I think, for example, most parents just try their best, to be good parents, and things happen, and they're under so much pressure and things, and so. But by saying that it's something wrong with the person, it absolves everyone else around them. So that's why I call it fear and absolution.
Now, I would say that there is parts of the the wellness model of mental health that has gone very mainstream. Everyone is talking about wellness. We go from wellness, and if we just tweak it, let's talk wellness. I just read a book called Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate. I absolutely recommend it. If you haven't read it, it's a beautiful book. And first of all, it details the real myth of trauma for the first 4 or 5 parts of the chapter. And then the last part of it gives some really great answers and like, hey, this is what we can do, And I really feel like Gabor Mate, I feel like he's got a lot of views. So he's doing that's really great. Another person, and I want to ask your perspective on this. It's called Internal Family Systems, and what it is, and my therapist told me about it. And it's something more about the trauma within your body and kind of how it affects you. Now, is there truth to the idea that the trauma that we have lives in our body?
So there's this other great book called The Body Keeps a Score by Bessel van der Kolk or something like that. And he talks about this and the different ways to get through it. So trauma can kind of fundamentally alter the way that you perceive things and stuff. And so I think that part is true. So, and different people can experience what seems like the same trauma, and some people have problems with it, and other people just shrug it off.
What if we were to take the idea of peer support, which is so effective, and we were to add things like just letting people know about the brain-body connection and having it part of fucking DSM-5 or whatever that is, like putting it in there and be like, that's a thing, you guys should read it whenever you're reading about all these other diagnoses. And like waking people up to the idea that yes, there is like mainstream treatment, and then there's also these treatments like Soteria houses, like peer work, like and then there's these interesting things. Of course there's like other stuff, like experimental treatments and things like that. We could get into that another time, but we've been talking for a long time. But let me wrap this up with saying, if we were to merge the idea of Soteria houses, peer respites, peer support, and also the ideas of like people knowing about stuff like trauma, body keeps a score, and things like that, wouldn't that world be a little bit more of a more improved place?
Well, yeah, I mean, and kind of trauma-informed care, the phrase trauma-informed care is kind of a buzzword or watchword these days, and but it's kind of been subsumed within this, what's called the medical model, which is there's something wrong with people, and that you need the drugs, and that's just not true. I mean, my way of looking at it is that what ends up being diagnosed as psychosis or mental illness is really the reaction to what's happened to people. And so, to give you an example, there's people can have multiple personalities. I mean, it's called dissociative identity disorder now, but it's always happens in the same way. As a young child, they've been horribly abused, and as a reaction to that, they pull themselves, mentally away from it, and so that abuse is happening to someone else. So, and that's how they can get through it, and how they can survive and tolerate. And that's a pretty, pretty good adaptive, response to what's happening to them. And so then what happens, that whereas we might have a different, way that we react to people, like if we're in, a job interview versus, on a date or something like that, they get so that they have these different personality, different places in the brain, different personalities for different situations. And that then becomes multiple personalities. And if the different personalities or alters, as they're called, don't know what the other ones are doing, of course, it's chaotic. But it's not anything inherent in or defective in the person. It's a very adaptive response. And that's really kind of an extreme example of what gets diagnosed, what happens when people get diagnosed with mental illness. And we need to think of it that way, and that all of this has meaning, and that we just need to, relate to people, be with them, ask them what they, what would be helpful, what they want. And it was interesting you said that, that becoming a peer specialist really is what helped you recover. And that's really quite typical, that having something meaningful to do, like a job, is critical, and is very important for people to recover.
Well, Jim, I want to expand on this. I know we've been talking for a little while, so I'm gonna wrap this up, but I have a couple more thoughts for you. One thing that I want to talk about is your last point. Something that you love, right? Oddball Foundation, Oddball Show. Love it. I can talk about it all day. I work on it all day. There's so many moving parts. There's editing podcasts. There's video. There's talking to cool people like you. There's like trying to improve your fucking old magazine that you just kind of kept for so long. And then, and all this has been with me for 25 years. But before all of that, poetry. was my saving grace. I wrote all the time. I wrote all my thoughts down on paper, every single thing that I was thinking on paper. I wrote a couple books about it. They're up there, but like not those. Those are all like really published ones. The ones up top, those are ones that I published. What I'm getting at is everyone, regardless of who you are, whatever diagnosis you have, should find something that they love. And if it's not like a person, and it's not like someone, and if it's not like a family member, or if it's, you should have that, of course. But if you don't, find something you love. If you play basketball, shoot baskets till your fingers fucking bleed. Because that's what I used to do when I was a kid. I loved playing basketball, you know. But I'm not gonna get into it. It's 25-year-old trauma. People didn't believe in me. People said I couldn't make it. People said I'd never be able to do it. And I can fucking ball, Jim. But anyway, what I'm getting at is do what you love. Do what you love, whatever it is. And Jim, I'm sure you love what you're doing. I'm sure you loved Zyprexa papers. I'm sure you loved writing. I'm sure you loved the board of mind, being on the board and affecting change. And I'm sure you love being in fucking Hawaii. I'm sure you love everything. So what Al Galv said, he said, all you need is love. And it doesn't have to be like, oh, you love somebody. You just love something. And that's what I got from what you just said there. Because it wasn't peer support. Peer support was like, hey, this gives me a fucking purpose vocationally. I don't know what peer support is. I didn't know what the code of ethics was. I didn't know anything about it. I just knew that I had a lot of hurt and it gave me a place for it. But even if you never become a peer support specialist, and I want to tell every single person who's listening to this podcast who's never had a shot because they have been given a diagnosis and they can't fucking get off the couch. If you can't get off the couch, that's fine. But if you are enjoying the book you're reading, then enjoy it. And if you want to write your own book, then write it. And if no one fucking publishes it, publish it yourself. And who cares? Maybe it'll be picked up. But it's the point. It's the love, the blood, the sweat, the tears of just being engaged in something and what people would call flow, right? That the idea of flow. And I think that's beautiful. I want to ask you one other thing, Jim. What do people, me included, I'm someone who's on psych meds. I can't help it. I tried getting off of them. And right now at this point, don't think I'm getting off them for the time being. How do people who are on psychiatric meds, because we demonize them. A lot of people demonize them. And I fucking don't like them, but they've saved my life in so many ways. But the prolonged use of them, how can someone who is on these meds keep sharp? How can they keep sharp even on these meds? What advice would you give to people, whether it's like an app, like apps that, you use or books that you would read or whatever it is? What do you give the advice to people who are on psych meds who are like, I'm on these psych meds and I'm just going to dull down and that's it? How do you keep someone sharp?
Well, I think that's a difficult thing. And I mentioned that you could, doing other things, you can get a recovery rate of 80% versus 5% if people stay on the drugs. But people who've been on the drugs and try and get off of them, then you can get a 40% recovery rate, which is 8 times better than 5, but half of 80. So one thing is it's really important to try and not get on them in the first place. But I know people, and I sound pretty negative about the drugs, and I basically am, but I know people that find them helpful, and you're one of them. And that's fun, and they should, well, I would say, yeah, I mean, there are downsides to it, but and I think people should have access to them, but no one should ever be forced on them.
I agree.
My attitude, and once you've been on them, there are changes in the brain that they cause that can make it very difficult to get off of them. And so some people can, some people can't. But my philosophy is less is better than more. So, and that, just, take them as you feel that that you need them, that you find them to be helpful. The problem, of course, is a lot of people are forced to take them, and they don't have that option. And one thing I do want to mention is from what you were saying is kind of the two things that are really important for recovery is hope and someone believes in you. And you mentioned both those things when you were talking, but in your case it was that no one believed in you, and that's really bad.
But it's bad, bro.
and that's and it's to your credit that you got through that, and that's one of the really terrible things about our mental health system is basically its message is abandon all hope ye who enter here. And it's just not true. And that's one of the I was mentioning it earlier on about my book that I write about these different psychiatric survivors who did recover and go on to do really great things, is to bust that myth. So it's really important for people to understand that they can get better no matter how long it's been or what they've been through. And it doesn't have to be no drugs. The main thing, and I think what you said about doing something that you love, not everybody can do that. People have got to eat and have a place to live and that kind of stuff. So, but it's really good to find something that's really meaningful to do.
Jim, can I ask you a question? How does an aging population keep their mental health sharp? I mean, you look great. I don't know if you can see this on the YouTube video. This guy is so tan. I am not tan. I keep on, Jim, half the time I've been looking at you like, how the fuck is he so tan? And I'm looking at I look like a goddamn ghost, but that's okay. But how do you keep people and maybe who people are still on psych meds, and they might even have type 2 by now. They might have some other things. How do you keep them sharp? How do you keep them well? And how do you keep them living past this really bad mortality rate? Besides getting off psych meds, yes, get off psych meds if you can. Right now, at the moment I'm at, I can't. I have a daughter. I just can't. But 20 years from now, I hope to God I'm off them. But if you're not, say you're on, you're struggling, and you are a little older, you are 50, 60 years old. How do you get someone to keep healthy while they're on psych meds as you age in life?
Well, I think it's not really different than anybody else. I mean, not that I'm really an expert on this, but one of the things I do is, I get pretty good exercise. So, exercise, move, moving is really good. Exercise, eating well. And then I think, again, meaningful activity and relationships, keep your mind active, doing things. I think reading is good, especially my book.
So it's no joke, Jim. Zyprexa can cause hundreds, maybe not hundreds. For me, I was on it, I gained 30 pounds. I'll be honest with you. I was on it, I got off of it immediately, and I gained 30 pounds. And I was at the point where I was pushing like shit. I could go type 2 if I don't get off this shit. There might be people right now who are on something like a heavy hitter. Now, you said eat well, sleep, meditate, all that shit. You got to work twice as hard when you're on these heavy hitters. Am I wrong or am I right?
These chemicals have effects. So again, I would say less is better. Less is better. So even if you can't get out, and a lot of people find that they can pretty drastically reduce the dosages, and they just can't get that off that last little bit. Well, that's
what happened to me. That's what happened to me, Jim. That's what happened to me.
Yeah. Well, that low dose is way better than a higher dose. That's the first thing I would say. You mentioned 30 pounds. It's quite common for people to gain 100 pounds on Zyprexa in a year.
That's
and then And then, when the doctors started telling Lily that, they said, "Oh, that's from schizophrenia."
What does that mean? What does that mean? Is
just,
Zyprexa supposed to help schizophrenia or
yeah, no, but
whatever?
they're saying it's from the person's that's from their having schizophrenia.
The way they think. Oh my God, what bullshit, Jim. What bullshit.
Yeah, well, they say it's physical. Well, they just make that up. They just made that up. That's why it was so important to get these documents out.
Didn't people buy that hook, line, and sinker, though? People bought that. People bought the fact that schizophrenia would be cured because all these like psych commercials. I once saw a commercial where it was like, this med is great, and the guy's like painting a picture, and he's like washing his car, and he's doing some menial shit, but I'm doing it. I'm like, I'm using my debit card because I can, because I'm on meds now. Like, I'd love to see someone like, I'm on the fucking moon and I'm on whatever, but I want to just say, and I'm going to wrap this up because I really appreciate it that you've been on the show, Jim. You've written the Zyprexa papers. Do you find passion in writing?
As a lawyer, it's basically writing most of the time. You might go into court sometimes and you might have an oral argument and stuff like that, but it's basically writing. But when it was really an extraordinary set of events that I, was involved in, and I just knew from the beginning that I needed to write a book about it. So I did. Yeah, I like to write. I do a lot of writing.
Jim, is there another book in you?
No, no, not really. I don't think so. Maybe. I'm working on this, what I'm calling a white paper with other people, but in Alaska, there's a report the legislature required last year in legislation that passed last year that I got them to include that they should report on how to improve patient outcomes. And this is psychiatric patient outcomes. And that's huge. So I'm really writing this thing to go through the evidence on all this stuff and what should be done. And we've touched on a lot of it, employment, peer respite, Soteria houses, peer support generally. Did I say employment?
I think you did.
Twice. Yeah. So housing, and the idea that if it's not voluntary, it's not treatment. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do some writing.
So last question. What's next for Jim? What's next for Jim Gottstein? What are you doing next?
I don't know. We'll see what comes.
I've been wanting to say this the whole time. You finish your thought, but I wanted to say this the whole time. So go ahead. Say what you're going to say.
Yeah, I'm pretty much retired from practicing law, but there's one type of case I'd come out of retirement for, which is most of the psychiatric drugs given to children and youth is Medicaid fraud, and especially for foster children. And there's this federal statute that you can sue for fraud on behalf of the government and share in the recovery, if any. And so each false claim, it's called the False Claims Act, carries a minimum penalty of $5,500, and each prescription is a false claim. So the idea, like any pediatric psychiatrist worth their salt would have prescribed 1,000 of these, and the 6-year statute of limitation, that's $5.5 million. And the idea is to tag, one or more of these prescribers and bankrupt them and scare the shit out of everybody else. And so I would come out of retirement to do that, but I'd have to do it with someone else.
Well, Jim, I hope so. I hope you do. But in the meantime, I hope you go surfing. I've been wanting to say that for like an hour and a half. Do you surf? Are you a surfer?
I don't, but I go swimming. And this is what it looks outside my window pretty much right now.
That is not real. Is that real? Oh,
that's
my
a
God.
picture.
That is a beautiful picture.
Looking right outside from my desk. It's not live, but it's like this 80% of the time.
Jim, you see what you get.
I walk down and swim in the ocean. I'm not a surfer, but
God bless you, man. God
the
bless you.
occasional sea turtle swims under me.
God bless you, Jim. Hey, Jim, thank you for being on this show. I know it was a long one. Last question I always end with this. What book are you reading right now, and what would you recommend besides your book, The Zyprexa Papers, which, if you've been listening to the Oddball Show on YouTube, there's been a QR code on this the whole time, and in the show notes on all the podcasts, there will be a link. But if you're watching on YouTube, QR code, just click on it. This book is hard to find, but Jim also will sign it.
It's not.
But Jim, you will sign it though. Like if you buy it, you can sign it, right? You can get it signed by you.
Yeah, I'm easy to find, and I've got a website, thezyprexapapers.com, and there's a link to a signed copy order page, so you can just do it that way. So the book I'm reading now, interestingly, is called Growing Up Mad in the South, and it's really quite good, and I'm a little more than halfway through. Probably the most important book to read is called Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker, which goes into the whole thing. But that's, that was first published in 2010. But then the most recent book I think that's so important is called Your Consent is Not Required by Rob Wypond, and he goes into all the ways that people are forced by psychiatry and other ways, including guardianships, but forced drugging and in employers and the military and all that kind of stuff. It's really a very, very good book.
Jim, I want to thank you for being on the show. It's been a really pleasure. Wow, I really feel like I learned a lot. Everyone, please check out the Zyprexa Papers. Learn more about this story. Open up your eyes and think about the things that could be changed, right? There's some things that could be changed here. And Jim Gottstein is one of these people who is making the changes. So if you are listening to the Oddball Show and you've listened to this long, fucking God bless you. Thank you for listening. And Jim, thank you for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It was fun.
This has been Oddball Show. My name is Jason Wright, and see you real soon.
If you liked what you heard in this episode, learned something new, and want to stay up to date on what's going on with Oddball Show, please consider liking this episode and leaving a review. Subscribe to Oddball Show on YouTube, Buzzsprout, or wherever you get your podcasts. And check out oddballmagazine.org for more fascinating stories, poetry, and art. Thanks for listening.